And so now we get to talk about behaviorism. So as I said, our British empiricism of that idea that all of our experiences, all of our knowledge comes from empiricism, comes from interacting with things around us, that was really refined and put forward as this perspective of behaviorism. And so behaviorists would say that the environment, our external stimuli, the things around us, are what control our behavior. And they control our behavior by learning. So, for an example, as a child, maybe you touched a hot stove and it burned your hand. And now you don't touch the stove. So you learned by interacting with the stove that you don't want to touch it. It's a bad thing, it causes pain. And so your behavior changes based on what you learn. So a behaviorist focuses on that process. Interacting with your environment taught you something and directly led to a change in your behavior. Now, if you consider the fact that we're coming out of our structuralism and functionalism, which came out of our monism and dualism discussion, we're going from looking at what is the mind doing, or what is the mind made up of, or how should we consider the mind, and all of a sudden, behaviorists actually don't care about the mind at all. We're only looking at behavior. We're only looking at the external, the environment, and how we interact with it. So this is a radical reorientation of psychology. And in fact, a behaviorist would use a different definition of psychology than what we've established. So a behaviorist might say that psychology is the study of behavior and not the mind, so just behavior. And for them, their definition of behavior would be a little bit more stringent than the one that we've used. So we've talked about behavior being sort of external actions, as well as some internal things like thoughts and emotions. But a behaviorist would be stricter than that, and they would say that behavior is only our overt and observable responses or activities. It's only the stuff that they can see and monitor and document. So this is quite the swing in the other direction from all of those sort of mental perspectives, coming into more of an environmental and behavioral-based perspective. And so our figure here is John B. Watson, and his rationale for embracing this behaviorist perspective was actually that he really disliked mentalism, that sort of focus on the mind and cognition that came from the earlier schools. He figured that psychology should focus on observable behavior and completely ignore that unobservable inner consciousness stuff. To them, we have thoughts and things going on internally, but it isn't relevant. We're focusing on the behavior. And we can actually take that even one step further and look at radical behaviorism. And this is quite the interesting perspective because they take behaviorism and they crank it up to 11. So radical behaviorists would say that the environment is the only factor that controls learning and behavior. And the big name for radical behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. And we'll actually talk quite a bit about Skinner in the chapter on learning, because Skinner pioneered quite a few of our behavior modification techniques. So he's well known for getting started with operant conditioning. So we'll talk quite a bit about that in future classes. But Skinner's perspective is summed up in this quote here, where he says, "No account of what's happening inside the human body, no matter how complete, will explain the origins of human behavior." And by saying that, he means that even if you understood everything going on inside a person's body and mind, it wouldn't completely explain their behavior. So from his perspective, he's saying that not only is the mind worth ignoring, but it's completely irrelevant to behavior. So that's why it's radical behaviorism. He is saying behavior is from the environment and the environment alone. Internal stuff doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. So we're going really extreme here. And so if you've picked up on the process here, you might have figured out that somebody's going to come along and have an issue with these perspectives. Which brings us to the cognitive revolution. So we went from a lot of mentalist perspectives, considering the mind and what the mind is doing and how it does it. And then we switched all the other way and went to the environment. And now we're going to find kind of a happy in between. And so this is our cognitive revolution, and we're going to talk about cognitive behaviorism, which is kind of like a softer version of behaviorism. And technically, my perspective and my research falls under this category. So I would identify as a cognitive behaviorist because I focus a lot on the environment. As I've mentioned before, my research revolves around operant conditioning. So I've done a lot with Skinner's stuff, but I don't completely dismiss the role of the conscious mind. So cognitive behaviorism is the mix between the cognitive, that mental capacity and the mind's component, as well as the environment and how that affects your behavior. So cognitive behaviorists say that our learning experiences and the environment affect our behavior, not necessarily directly, but by giving us the information that we need to behave effectively. So we learn by interacting with our environment. We learn that the stove is hot by touching it, and then we choose not to touch the stove again because of the information that we've gathered, because of what we've learned in the past. So this is kind of a softer version of behaviorism that starts bringing the mind back into the picture. And so one of our figures in cognitive behaviorism is Albert Bandura. And I mention him because he was born in Alberta and is a big figure in cognitive behaviorism. So I don't think you'll find him in your textbook, but he is a very useful individual. And Bandura thought that our environment and the things that we experience would influence our thoughts, and our thoughts would then influence our behavior. So pretty much right under that definition of cognitive behaviorism. And so if cognitive behaviorism exists, maybe things keep going in that cognitive direction. And in fact, start getting into cognitive psychology. So this is the continuation of our cognitive revolution. And this actually came about because of a couple of different events in history. So the cognitive revolution is a shift away from behaviorism that happened in sort of the early 1950s. So we start showing a renewed focus on the mind, mental states, and internal processes. People started looking at humans as information processors. So we are governed by thought. Our thoughts determine our actions, so our behavior comes from what we think about. And a lot of the terminology that we started using in this period relates to computers, which were becoming more and more prevalent at the time. So this information processor sounds a lot like how we talk about a computer. And you'll start seeing when we get into the chapter on memory, we talk about things like long-term memory storage, or saving memories for later, uploading and downloading them, retrieving them and sending them places. So a lot of the ideas, a lot of the models for how memory works came about at this time during the cognitive revolution as computers were becoming more and more common. They were still very restricted to university spaces and sort of, I guess, like scientific applications and stuff like that, but they were becoming more and more known, hence the terminology. And the really cool part about this cognitive revolution that I found is that a lot of this shift was actually driven by the occurrence of World War II. And so they were getting away from that behaviorism. They were starting to wonder about how the mind works. And then as the war broke out, they had to start thinking about how can we make things easy to use? How do people view things? How do they interpret information? How can we lay out machines? How can we lay out gauges and dials? How can we put this here so that it's easy to understand and easy to use without a whole lot of training? So this is a massive interest in our cognitive processes and how we view our world and how we interpret that information. So it was definitely important as the war was going on. And then as we got away from the war, behaviorism started coming back. There's sort of a little bit of a shift there again, but they're always going to exist kind of in contrast to one another. So the behaviorists and the cognitive psychologists are always going to differ a little bit on perspective.